Tēnā koe matua Ruakere. Tēnā pia, ka tai koe te introduce yourself, tēnei wā?
Um, my name is Ruakere Hond. I'm from here in Taranaki. My marae are primarily Pariaka, Punio and Wharepuni.
Okay. Are you able to explain about our kaupapa coming up, te putake o te riri?
Te putake o te riri is something that was initiated by a petition that was run by Otoranga High School when they learnt as part of their education the history of Orako, the Battle of Orako, and realising that at that time in particular there was the emphasis on the 100 years of Gallipoli, the Anzac kōrero and the commemorations that were taking place, and they asked the question, why aren't the battles that occurred here in Aotearoa recognised in any formal way? And so they put forward a petition for a day to be set aside where those conflicts of the past, but also the approaches that were used to find peace, could be recognised. But that initially there was opposition towards that, but then as people's awareness grew and people started to understand more around the history, I think the real issue was really that many of the people around that area in Orako, that's not far from Te Awamutu, not many of the people really understood the history, and they hadn't heard it before. So it took a while for that awareness to build, and then once the awareness built to a sufficient level where the petition really took off. This is in 2015. They delivered the petition, and the government said yes, now is the time to set aside a day to commemorate what took place in those times during the New Zealand Wars, but also around how we recognise our history, and that is a particular perspective of our shared history that needs to be recognised in this formal way.
Just in the preparations and the build-up of this monumental national day that's happening here in Waitara, what is the preparations? What is the program?
So this is the second event to be held. So in last year that it was held in Taitokero, way up north in Waitangi, and in that event the focus was about allowing people to engage with some of these sites, and so we've carried some of that into what has been delivered here in Taranaki. Given that we're following a rough sequence of the first conflicts occurred in Taitokero, and then if we're following that timeline, well, then we end up here in Taranaki, and Waitara was the flashpoint that led to the escalation of war throughout Taranaki and then to the rest of the country over land. But for us in Taranaki, the event is an opportunity for people to come listen to kōrero that relates to the tupuna that were involved in those activities in those times, to the tragic occurrence of violence and the war that occurred in Waitara. So we'll be following a similar sort of routine. On the first day is largely speakers, a pōhiri, and there'll be a live broadcast on the Monday night. This is Labour Monday. And then after the first day, the focus then moves to giving people the opportunity to visit three of the key sites. So that's Māhoetahi, which is just on the main road by the turn off to Inglewood, at Puketā Kauere and Pukerangiora. So for many people that live around this area in Waitara, many of them wouldn't have even heard of the names, or if they've seen the hills as they drive past, they haven't understood what the significance of those sites are. So there'll be buses going and taking groups through. We're hoping, so they'll rotate. There'll be 3 different groups or 4 groups rotating around those 3 sites. And at the same time, there'll be workshops for schools in Orwai. Then later on that night, there'll be a wānanga that will be held in the evening looking at historical figures. There are a whole lineup of speakers that will be delivering different perspectives of different tupuna that were involved in those early stages. So we're talking about from 1860 through to about 1867 before Tito Waru's campaign kicks off. So that that's on the Tuesday the 29th, and then on the 30th is the closing process. There'll be a breakfast, then speakers, and then a number of karakia and those other things that are done. Then a hakari, and then after that there'll be the formal farewell and the official passing of this kaupapa to the group from Waikato, Tainui, who will be coming down to receive this kaupapa, and we'll be running it next year in their rohe.
How important is it for New Zealanders, this kaupapa?
Well, I think the real issue is our perception of who we are. So for many people who don't know much about the history of this country, quite often the first reaction is, look, it's just in the past, let's put it aside, and we've got to move on. That's usually the what will be voiced from a person who doesn't know the significance of that history. So if we fail to recognise these historical events, we don't really have a good appreciation of who we are as a country. So we form a very shallow perspective, and it tends to be more in the here and now rather than understanding how we became a country, how we formed relations within this country between peoples that are within Aotearoa, and that what I believe, and many others support the view as well, is that by having a robust sense of shared identity, understanding where we sit within the country and how it came to be like this, well then we're better able to plan for the future, and that the next generations will be that much better prepared to really engage with who they want to be in their time, because identity is always changing. But it's by understanding the past, it helps us form a better appreciation of our identity today.
How important is it to taranaki? How important is taranaki?
For taranaki, the what we're hoping to gain from this, I mean, obviously we're wanting to say that things did occur here in Taranaki, and we continue to recognise. Māori have never forgotten this. It's embedded in our waiata, in our kōrero, in so many different aspects of our life. But the rest of Taranaki, it is largely invisible. So people might look at Waitara and consider it's a place where maybe they consider it as a place where the Bothworks meatworks were. There's a lot of sporting heroes that have come from there. Beyond that, well, what is the significance of Waitara? Well, for Māori, Waitara is hugely significant, and so the points of reference in our history, in our waiata, and our kōrero constantly return back to Waitara. And so it's an opportunity for us to share what our perspective is of Waitara, but also allow non-Māori people in Taranaki to share their perspectives of what Waitara, what the impact of war was. And by coming together and sharing that, and so we've purposely included many different voices within that, so that we hear different perspectives. By hearing the range and the diversity of perspectives, then we're able to consider, well, where to next for us in Taranaki. But at a national level for Taranaki, we have the opportunity to showcase Taranaki, what occurred in Taranaki. We had the longest period of conflict of war than anywhere else in the country. So we're talking from 1860 is when the conflict started over land, and it continued through until 1881, so 21 years later, with the attack on Pariaka. And the people were still imprisoned and continued to protest right up until the last group of prisoners to be returned back in 1898. So we're talking a long period of time. We're talking 38 years at least of active resistance, whether that is through the violence of warfare, or whether that is using passive resistance or non-violent resistance. These were all expressions of concern and the determination of Taranaki Māori to retain land, and their protest against the use of confiscation as punishment. So many groups, even though they weren't even involved in the war, weren't actively engaged in the war, they had their lands confiscated alongside many others. So the use of confiscation was really to strip the economic base from Taranaki. So we have the opportunity now to understand that better, and as iwi and as Māori start to become more prominent in the area of economically, socially, culturally within the region, it gives us the ability to say, well, and ask the questions, what was it before 1860? What were our tupuna saying they wanted in those times? And that will help guide us as to where we head in going into the future.
Just around the putake o te riri being the starting of the land wars, and there's a concept around te putake o te maungarongo. Would you like to just share a little bit about those two concepts being one concept?
Well, when it was first proposed about having commemoration, having an event, and the name Putake o te Riri was being spoken about, we were already having the debate in Taranaki saying, why are we focusing just on the acts of violence and the warfare? For many accounts of history, it's really a body count of what's taken place in terms of the conflict. It goes from one conflict to the next, and we don't really recognise what other people were doing in our society. So we really put forward the view that what about all of the people who continued to resist but used peaceful means? And it's not just Taranaki that was using non-violent resistance. Many other iwi around the country were using non-violent resistance against what the Crown was doing. And so we need to highlight that at the same time. We can't just focus in on the violence of warfare and be defined by that. So Putake o te Riri is, as I would interpret it, is what is the foundation, what is the basis of the violence that occurred during war. So Riri is anger, aggression, warfare and violence. Generally, that's how you would describe it. But the putake means what is its foundation, what is the basis of that. And so when we think about Putake o te Riri, what we're thinking about, what was it that drove the violence and the conflict to begin with? And by understanding those drivers, then we understand more around what was happening more broadly in society at that time. So it has been proposed that maybe over the next 20, 30, maybe even longer, 35 years' time, we will be able to move outside of a focus on violence and the war, and into one more around how does this country recognise the acts of peace and relationship building, and say there are many positive things that happened. It wasn't all doom and gloom. There were many positive things that happened. However, the weight of colonisation meant that those acts of peace were largely made invisible, and largely ignored to a point where they never really gained the traction that the people involved were seeking to achieve. The idea of te putake o te riri for us in Taranaki is really around saying we want to focus in on what were the drivers that led to war rather than the war itself.
Was the pāhuatanga something significant around these dates being quite close to each other?
Well, it was proposed right at the beginning. Well, which day are we going to choose? So some people said, well, we'll just allow every region to choose their own date, and that's fine too. Every region can choose and have the event on a date that is meaningful to them. But then when we look at it from a national perspective, how does the country together come upon a way in which the concept of Putake o te Riri, we can all come together. So it's not just focusing on one region alone, but what is it that actually looks across the whole country and says, what is Putake o te Riri for us? That's where it was proposed to focus in on the Declaration of Independence. So for many Pākehā within the country have never even heard that there was a Declaration of Independence. So te whakaputanga o te rangatiratanga o New Tireni was signed in 1835, just a mere 25 years before the war began, where the rangatiratanga, the authority of Māori, was recognised by the Crown and then 5 years following that, in 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed. So the Declaration of Independence was a precursor to that, and many would say it's probably more important in that was the point at which the Crown recognised that the people who were living in Aotearoa at the time, the Māori, our tupuna who were here, had authority and should be recognised. And so the Declaration of Independence was signed on the 28th of October, which is the date that we in Taranaki have decided to support. So many of the regions around the country made a very strong case that if we have it on the 28th of October every year, then it becomes part of a regular annual event. And so we've supported that in Taranaki. It's partly also the fact that there were so many battles within Taranaki, trying to choose a battle that would then signify what takes. Would we focus on the Pāhua, which happened, the soldiers marched in on the 5th of November, or do we focus in on the 17th of March? There were lots of discussions to and fro on that issue, but I think generally the view is that we support the 28th of October to say what is the foundation of this aggression, and that is the lack of recognition of the agreement that was signed by the Crown in 1835, which is the Declaration of Independence of Rangatira within this country, which then became a foundation document to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. So by having it on the 28th, it puts that back into prominence, and it puts it into perspective that these wars weren't about land. They were about land, but ultimately they were wars about authority. How do we manage land? Who has the authority to be able to say this land belongs to this group, this land belongs to that group, and what are the practices we're going to use as to how that land is utilised. That was the clash. That's what drove it. So Māori wanted to retain land in Taranaki. Pākehā settlers that were in Taranaki at the time desperately wanted land, and the vehicle that was used to resolve those two different perspectives was violence of war. So easy to go to war and use war as a means to find a resolution. Very much a zero-sum approach. One side loses, one side wins, problem solved. Well, that just doesn't happen. The problem remains there generations upon generations later. And here we are today working to find a resolution to that, where we can share our collective identity, that is Taranaki.
What advice would you have for those who are thinking about, having a little listen, or, what advice would you have for those who are kind of new to the history as well, and kind of new to Māoridom, or a bit worried?
Well, there are actually a lot of books that are written about history in Taranaki and the country as a whole. So there's books like Ask That Mountain, recent books that have come out, all talk about what was taking place at the time. And some talk about it from different perspectives. So some talk about it from a Māori perspective, others talk about it from a more of a settler perspective, and that's all good, because we need to see all of that diversity. But for those who want to engage in that history, who want to comprehend what that is, will definitely come along on that day. On the 28th is the Pōhiri date, and come along on the 29th, where we visit the sites where there's a school education program that's happening at Waitara, and go and visit the museum, go and visit other places where this history is there to be looked at and to be engaged with. So there are more than enough opportunities available. There's even a website and a phone app where you can go to different sites around Taranaki, and on the phone app, that's the Heritage, Taranaki Heritage. That app gives background to some of these key historical sites, and so the ability to engage with our history has never been stronger, and we will always have differences of views, differences of opinions about that history, and that's great. I think it's important that we continue to have debates and discussions. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always one-sided. there were things happening for both groups of people, and by recognising that, then we actually start building a sense of truth that is more relevant to our lives today.
And how can families or organisations or people find out more information for the program or the dates or the pōwhiri times?
Probably the easiest way is to go onto Facebook. If you're a Facebook user, then you know exactly what to do. If you're not, well then find a young person who's into Facebook and to guide you through that. If you look up Putake o Te Riri, so P-U-T-A-E, sorry, I'll say that again, P-U-T-A-K-E, and then another word O, which is the letter O, and then another word T-E, and then another word R-I-R-I, Putake o Te Riri. If you go on to Pukamata, onto Facebook, or even on the website, there will be links to be able to see that. But Facebook has definitely got all the program, it's got background, and it's the best place to engage with it.
Well, kamuhi te kia koe. Thank you for sharing your kōrero around Te Pūtake o Te Riri, and hopefully all our listeners can make an informed decision on where they sit with it and support it and get behind it.
Mihi ana. I want to acknowledge those of you who are considering the past, to look at it with an open mind and realise that quite often the perspective we've grown up with actually needs to be readdressed and looked at it with another lens, so that we understand it from today's perspective with more information that we have now, and every generation will have more and more information made available to them. So kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui.
Tēnā koe.